Thanks everyone for joining in. Today we have Lavanya, who is the founder and CEO of Carboledger, a company with a mission to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally. So thank you again for coming on board today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ronak, for having me.
Absolutely. So, before we dive into Carboledger, I'm curious, what led you to start a company in the kind of climate tech space?
So it's got to do a lot with what I've been doing in the last few years. So I finished my undergrad in chemical science and technology, and all through undergrad, I was very much into research in chemicals and biophysical sciences, etc. And wanted to do my PhD in biophysics, and with an aim that I would somehow end up doing something in the environmental side, because I always wanted to work in the environmental side. But how things work in India in education is that you pass a ton of entrance exams, and then whatever lands on your feet, you just happen to take it with a leap of faith that this will lead you somewhere. But at the back of your mind, you always have your passions and aspirations. So I just wanted to combine the two of whatever happened and what I wanted to do. But at the end of 4 years, I realized that this is a long way to take, and I might just go and take that leap of faith, which is governed by my choices, and just go into environmental sciences program and start working in the field altogether. So that's when I decided to take my master's in climate change science and policy from Columbia University. So, and that is when the concerted working in the field began. And since then, I had worked in the development sector, then as a consultant with smaller businesses, looking into the sustainability accounting and mostly carbon accounting. So while I was doing that, I realized that there is a huge gap in how carbon accounting reporting and the accounting itself is done. And that's when the ideas had started popping up, and that's when also the world trends started moving towards a more accurate form of recording. Or up until now, only voluntary organizations were spearheading the whole accounting, the whole accounting piece of the puzzle. But now we were seeing that regulatory authorities, for example, USSEC, and then in India, the Securities Board of India, which had also started to bring in more a regulatory angle to carbon accounting and other sustainability reporting. So we thought that this is picking up trend, not just in the voluntary space, but also in the regulatory space. And this is a good time to enable enterprises which were in the first line of these regulations, right? So that is when we started Carboledger. That is when we started talking to people about all things reporting, which were not just limited to carbon accounting. But a year or less now, we have pretty much settled that carbon accounting is the space that we want to work on.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And did the idea of Carboledger come from more regulations from the state of India, and then now companies have to start reporting this type of data out? Was that kind of a good indicator for you that this is something that's needed in the market?
Yes, yes. The idea did come out of India, but then when we started reading more, we realized that almost every other country is bringing in these similar kind of regulations, if not more stringent. So, so that's where the idea started. And of course, India's regulation were more on the ESG umbrella rather than just the carbon accounting bit or just the environment bit. But then, how our journey started is that we started speaking to a lot of people who would be required to now submit these reports, right? Or give accounting, regulated regulation based data at the end of the year to authorities in India or elsewhere in the world. And what we started to realize is that even though people had been doing it for voluntary purposes before or for their own sustainability reports annually, the kind of gap or the problems that they still face is how to do it, uh, you know, from the scratch or from the first principle way, because how they had been doing it was very loosely defined and not so accurate. But when regulations had started to kick in, people had started to realize have started to realize that these might as well be more accurate, because this entails a lot of litigation risks and a lot of regulatory risks going forward.
Gotcha. Do you have an example of how companies, might have been doing in the past that wasn't as structured, and then now with, software like Carboledger, it's, becoming more structured and accurate?
Sure. So how companies were doing was using spreadsheets. So I try to dive in a little bit into what carbon accounting is actually. So most people in the world, or most industries in the world, follow something called GHG protocol. So GHG protocol was something which was developed by WRI, the World Resources Institute, and WBCSD, the World Business Sustainability Council. Uh, you know, so the where they had started from was they had divided your GHG accounting into three scopes: scope one, two, and scope three. So, scope one and two are something which entail all the activities that happen within an organizational boundary. And scope three is something which is your entirety of your supply chain. What your suppliers are doing, what happens to your product after you produce it, how did you do the transport, what your employees are, how they are commuting, or what kind of business travel they're taking, etc. So companies were very, had a good idea of how to measure their scope one and two. But how that scope one and two was happening was through Excel spreadsheets. And if we are talking about large enterprises here, right? So large enterprises have multiple units. So everyone was exchanging this data over emails, sometime once a year, and there was no way to audit it or check it back to the accuracy if somebody has done a miscalculation or somebody has, added an erroneous data or something like that. People did go through third party assurances, but this process of data collection was cumbersome in and of itself. So this is one bit of it. And then scope three, the whole piece was completely missing, because it's your entire supply chain and you can't really be doing through Excel sheets, right? So,
I see. So for that scope one and two, what are the differences between those two? And then it looks like scope three is essentially, all of the emissions that come from the supply chain to produce your, product or service.
right. So the difference here is that scope one and two is still somebody in your own organization. So you can still ask for a data in such and such a format, and then even though there are inter-organizational limitations to it as well, that a good number of people have to come together to understand that this is the format we would be collecting in data, or X person would be responsible for this data,
Yeah.
etc. But in scope 3 there's a lot of cooperation needed. You need to have all of your suppliers onboarded, you need to have all of your customers onboarded on one standard, that this is how we are going to exchange data, or this is the platform that we're going to use. So that's where the data problems begin in both of these things.
Makes sense. Yeah, that can definitely, I can see it get pretty messy. And just for the audience, what's the difference between scope one and two in general and how it's measured?
Right. So, scope one is everything which is happening within your premises, any kind of combustion activities, you're burning fossil fuels, or you're using refrigerants for your chillers or for your ACs in your corporate offices, etc. And if you have company owned vehicles, so they also burn fossil fuels. So that is your scope one. Your scope two is the kind of energy that you're buying from third party resources. Energy, you buy your energy from the grid, and your grid is in turn fueled by thermal energy. So again, fossil fuels are being burnt. So this is how your scope two is mostly the energy that you bought, and scope one is the combustion activity that happened within your organization.
I see. Perfect. And from your standpoint, or just in general, I'm curious to, for you to just share, like, why is it important for us to lower our greenhouse gas emissions here.
Right. Yeah. So, greenhouse gas emissions for enterprises, I believe, why is it important to lower them? Of course, in the rest of the world, greenhouse gas emissions are causing global warming. So that is one thing that where we started from is that everybody in the team was more data centered. So of course we do believe that other kind of solutions in this space are important, but where we thought we could bring our expertise is honing on to that one thing, that GHG is the one which is contributing, how to bring down these numbers directly and more from a mitigation point of view, which is more was less hardware centric and more how can we bring in data to reduce the most of this. So why it becomes important for enterprises is that they share a large percentage of GHG emissions in the world. And of course, when we talk of enterprises, they oil and gas companies also form a part of it. So, and when we look at supply chains, we think that when you start thinking of GHG emissions as something which are stemming from each node of supply chain, and when you try to bring in more accuracy, more cooperation into one supply chain, uh, a lot of the world would be affected by it. And enterprises are where also a lot of finances are brought into the picture. Of course, it's your federal governments and the entirety of the world, of world leaders and political parties. But enterprises are something which are very well connected through your bottom lines of finances. So this is where we thought that data can be brought and change can be made from one enterprise at a time, which will then trickle down to the entirety of the supply chain. So this, of course, requires cooperation, but we thought that this is our way of bringing cooperation, other than world leaders getting towards building negotiations and cooperations.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the science behind it is, quite interesting too. So all three scopes have the ability to release these greenhouse gases,
Yeah,
also called the GHGs, as you've been saying. And then, as they're released, they some of them, get trapped in the atmosphere. And then as you see the sun's radiation hit Earth, and then the radiation come off of Earth, now that there's more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, more are getting trapped within Earth's atmosphere and staying within Earth, and thus heating up Earth. So I think it's key if we want to try to mitigate warming of the planet, then try to reduce the emissions of the culprits that are warming the planet, which has so many downstream effects on so many systems in the world.
right.
So I'm curious when it comes to measuring, it seems like there's different challenges to do measurements across the three scopes here. How are you tackling this at Carboledger on trying to measure a company's greenhouse gas emissions?
So with respect to scope one and two and the kind of enterprises that we're working with, like I mentioned, they have become pretty comfortable in understanding that. But I'll also come back to, in my times when la- back in time when I was working with smaller organizations, the really good anecdotes from there is that when I would approach people asking them that what are you doing about your GHG emissions. So, of course, people in smaller organizations don't understand GHG in and of itself, or what climate, or how they are contributing to climate change as a small organization, right? So you then start talking to them about what are you doing about environment and what are your emissions. So I was speaking to a pharma company once, and then they said that, oh, we don't have any emissions. Because most of our operations are run on electricity. We have high-end labs, or we have chilled labs, so all we do is use electricity, and there is no no fumes or no black smoke as we generally like to associate with pollution. So we are pretty much clean. So then is when we realize that there is a missing piece of knowledge also within enterprises, where people don't understand that even using a lot of electricity is contributing to climate change. Just because you can't see black smoke coming out of your fumes doesn't mean that you are not contributing to it. So how Carbo Ledger started off and how it has gone through a lot of change is we were trying to help people understand that this is what of your activities actually contribute to your scope 1 and 2, just limiting it to your organization, not even going to your scope 3. But when we started working with larger organizations, we realized that they're pretty comfortable with that. They have dedicated sustainability teams, so they know how to do it. The challenge that they were facing and what we help them with is the data collection part and actually making sense of it more scientifically, right? So, what connects your activity data, we like to call it, whatever you are doing on your factory shops, right? In your factory shops, so say suppose you burnt certain quantity of a fossil fuel. What connects it to the amount of GHG emissions that you actually end up emitting into the atmosphere is called an emission factor. So it's a scientific number. It takes in a lot of your fuel density, what's your calorific value of a fuel, etc. So a lot of scientific mumbo jumbo there, and then converts it into the actual amount of GHG emissions that you emit into the atmosphere. So this emission factor people were struggling with a lot as to where to get it from. Is it accurate enough? Is it geography specific? Because if I'm burning or if I'm using electricity in India, doesn't make sense that I'm using a US based emission factor. So these are the two pieces of the in the whole work bit that people were struggling with. One of them was data, and the second was to make scientific sense of it. So when you bring a software like Carboledger in the scope 1 and 2 part of it, it solves for both of this altogether. And also, since it's a common platform, all of the stakeholders within an organization come together to, you know, directly input data and also understand which of their activities is actually contributing to the larger enterprise's emissions.
I see. Do you think we could run through like an example of how you bring on a company and how they go through the process of measurements and then analyzing it and reduction? So, for example, if you bring on a pharma company or a bank,
Mhm.
um, how does that team start the process of using Carboledger? Do they start manually inputting all the different ways that they are emitting among the three scopes and then kind of proceed forward from there?
Yes. So it does require a first, a couple of months of onboarding or less, not even a couple of months. So in your scope 1, say for example, 5 of your activities are contributing to your scope 1. So you can, we make categories that these will be the categories responsible for your scope 1. And then each category either has one single data owner or multiple of them. And then there is a way of doing data entry which is pretty manual also, but you can automate it. So people generally end up using the more automated format, just bulk uploading their invoices from the last month, because uh,
What kind of invoices? Like utility invoices,
yes, yes.
things of those sorts?
Yeah, yeah. For scope 2, your utility invoices. For scope 1, you bought coal from a vendor, right? So those invoices come in, and then if you're maintaining a register of all the coal that you use, so you just need to upload that register, and then um, it is all that the software requires basically. So you just tell the software this much of code was used in the last month, and then the emission factors are already embedded, and it tells you that these were your GHG emissions. Going forward, there are dashboards, so you can see and you can compare from the last month or from the last year how much change has been in the amount of GHG emissions that this particular unit did. So in that way, you get a larger idea of how each unit is faring well as compared to each other. And of course, the person who's responsible for their own unit can see that we were doing a little better the last month. Why is there a discrepancy here, or some kind of a variance here?
I see. So, as companies start to implement, how they're using or how they're emitting these emissions by um, either purchasing things that produce emissions like coal, as you mentioned, or just directly on site. They then add these activities into the Carboledger software, and then based off the, I believe you said, emissions factor.
Mhm.
Uh, this then produces the amount of greenhouse gases that get emitted, and potentially the type of greenhouse gases as well. So, for example, like oil, is probably mainly carbon. Whereas if it's a farm, for example, there's a lot of animals, then maybe does this software then take into account that maybe more methane's being emitted, and then that takes into account the environmental impact.
Yes, it does. It does. So when I said the emission factor, it takes into account the associated methane emissions, and of course, your methane has a higher global warming potential than your carbon dioxide. So everything is embedded in the software, and when a user is looking at their emissions, they get a divided view of this was our contribution towards CO2, towards methane, and other greenhouse gases, and then of course an equivalent, which is what they need to report at the end of the year, but users themselves can see a breakdown of it as well. And so while working in the last 1 year, what we've realized that earlier enterprises were doing it once a year activity, like how you do your accounting. But accounting, used to be a once a year activity some 30 or 20 years ago. But now it has become a more quarterly results. People look at the company's quarterly results, how are you doing, etc. So
Right.
carbon accounting and sustainability reporting has been a once a year activity up until now, but now people are coming to realize, that, oh, I'm in 2021 or 2022, and I'm somehow doing things pretty badly in terms of my carbon emissions. But I'll only get to realize this at the end of the year when I sit down and do my emissions accounting. And then it will be too late because then I'll have to actually publish this data and this goes into public view. And there is just, I have probably lost a year of progress. So that is why people have come to realize that we need to use softwares like Carboledger to bring us up to speed and do carbon accounting more frequently within a year than just an year end exercise.
Yeah, that's a super interesting insight. And then, I'm sure the software can then, through the recommendations and the analysis, provide a predicted output that at the current rate, this is where it's going to be. And this would be, either above or below the company's goal. So that's really um, great insight to hear. And then when it comes to analyzing, is there any specific pieces on how the analysis is done based off all the data that the company has inputted, and how you provide these recommendations back to the company on how to reduce their emissions?
So on the first piece, analysis is done scope wise and through the years
Okay.
as well. So we see a time trend of how you are to one, how your emissions are divided amongst scope one, two, and three, and then time trends within scope one, and then also with time trends within each unit, and then a comparison between different units of an enterprise like that.
And when you say units, it's the type of greenhouse gas, like carbon, methane, etc., or
That is also there, but when I say units, these are different business units within an enterprise.
gotcha.
So one enterprise may have multiple factories across the world, so we try to do, maybe an intensity based analysis of how each unit is better or worse than the other. So in that ways, companies themselves can learn within each other, because we do see them as one entity, but when you start to work with such large entities, you'll come to realize that sometimes people are unaware of what is happening even within their own organization. So one business unit may be performing much better than the other, and there's a lot to learn from one of your sister units, but you never think of it as that ways and never go and talk to the person responsible there. So when you see this data in our analysis dashboard and you realize that, oh, why is this person doing better even though you're pretty much in the same country. So in India, two units may be performing very differently. So it's just these kind of
Yeah.
solutions are just a phone call away, but you just because the data was not in front of you, you were missing them. On the recommendations bit, we have not come there yet. The software doesn't provide any recommendations as of now. We are trying to build that part as to how we can from the platform itself start to provide a bit of recommendations that you are doing something here and your peer, so mostly peer benchmarking, that somebody in the same similar industry were able to bring their emissions down by this much. Maybe you could try something similar.
Yeah, that going back to just the analysis portion, that's super interesting when you mention different business units within a single company can have drastically different amount of emissions. In my head when you said that, I was thinking of different business units, and let's say a software company attributing different amounts of revenue to the overall company. Is there an example of like some business units that you could provide within kind of a broader company that's would have differing emissions? So I think you mentioned manufacturing as a unit will probably have high emissions. What are some other examples?
We have largely worked with manufacturing companies, but let's say your software companies, right? So I have an office in India, and I have another office in USA. So and software companies generally tend to have a lot of emissions in their scope 2 part and their scope 3, because they buy a lot of equipments, right? So a lot of their emissions is associated with the equipment that you buy. But let's just stick to scope 2 here. So let us say, for example, both of these business units use the same amount of electricity, but since they are buying electricity from the Indian grid versus the US grid, their emissions differ by a lot, because the kind of mix that Indian energy authorities or electricity authority is bringing into the grid, how much of it is fossil fuel, how much of it is wind powered or hydro, and versus what American grid is giving. And in America, your grid emission factors also differ by states. So in that ways, you will see a very large difference in the kind of emissions that two of your business units who are using the same amount of electricity, just hypothetically, but
Yeah.
they will have a very different amount of emissions that they make.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And then from your side as Carboledger, where do you get all this data to combine it with the data that the companies are providing to provide the correct, accurate information back to them? Like, what are these data sources? So I think one you mentioned is kind of like electricity. It has a different blended mix in different countries, clean versus more fossil fuel. Where's this data coming from, and what are some other data sources that you leverage?
Right, that's a great question. So, for electricity in countries, for example, India's Central Energy Authority, Electricity Authority releases a grid emission factor every year, so you can use that. And US also has similar grid emission factors being released periodically. And then coming to more repository of emission factors. EPA has a huge repository of emission factors that you use, and then IPCC has made some emission factors for your fossil fuels, combustion-based emission factors. Then UK has a repository called for from DEFRA, and likewise we have more private players also providing these kind of repositories. So we combine all of these repositories into our software into a one big uh, API where you can call for these emission factors. But things are still easier when it's just scope 1 and 2. Of course it is not as easy as I'm making it sound, because there are so many regions in the world where your grid emission factors are changing, so you have to make sure that whenever that they are being updated, your systems are being updated as well, etc. But the biggest challenge is your scope 3 emissions, because
Mhm.
scope 3 emissions are everywhere. Your suppliers are somewhere, and then they are using some kind of a manufacturing activity which are not being recorded in an industry average repository like your EPAs, right? So that piece becomes very difficult, and that is what we're trying to solve for also at Carboledger.
And then for that scope three piece, and trying to make it as accurate as possible, are you able to share kind of some of the things the company's trying to tackle for this challenge? Is it
Mhm.
more for more manual process, or just nudging the company to be like, hey, did you think of this and that across your supply chain, and then maybe going a little further down the road and providing maybe more data access or data tools for these companies to get more accurate for scope three?
Right. So what I find interesting about working in climate tech, Ronak, here is that everyone is learning. So scope three, even though the accounting principles have been in existence for a lot of time, people were still lagging behind, not doing it well or not doing it at all, right? So now that in the last couple of years everybody has started to do it and take interest in doing it, uh, I don't know if it's for the better of the or worse. Everybody is learning it together. So we are learning with the enterprises are learning with us and how to do it. So how scope three accounting for whoever was doing it had been happening up until now was taking something which we call industry average numbers, right? So
Okay.
say for example, you are a cement manufacturer in the US, I am one in India, and I'm taking some raw material, both from very different geographies, but US EPA or some other repository has an industry average maintained that if you are producing cement in and you are, exchanging some dollar value for cement, you can assign this much emissions to that dollar value exchanged, right? So this is a very industry and a global number which had no nuances for the geography that it is maintained or for the actual product raw materials that went into producing that cement, right? So people were doing very industry average emission numbers, which were good to start with, but these are not nuanced and these don't actually tell you what the problem or where the problem is stemming from. But what everyone is, including us, is trying to nudge people to do is to actually reach out to your suppliers and ask for their scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? So that you don't have to use industry average numbers. You can just ask your suppliers that what their emissions are. They can give you a direct data and we can start from here. We can start building your scope 3 from your supplier's scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's as if that as more and more companies start to report their scope one and two carbon emissions using, companies like Carboledger, it then, has that network effect of making that scope three more accurate. So that's exciting to hear. Um, and I'm curious. I think you touched upon it a little bit, but um, what's the incentive for companies to track their greenhouse gas emissions? Do you mainly see it for now more of either the company is taking kind of a branding angle that doing this will help the company's brand, which ultimately will help with more sales, um, and potentially also a combination of governments are requiring it, so thus companies have to do it. Are you seeing anything beyond those two?
For larger enterprises, there are three. One is
Okay.
definitely, like you mentioned, regulations. The other is branding. The third is investors. So investors are now looking to invest in more ESG friendly companies. And then, of course, there are litigational, regulational, and other kind of climate risks, physical and transitional risks themselves involved with investing in companies which are not doing well in terms of ESG and climate wise, right? So for larger enterprises, there are these three things. And when these larger enterprises want to reduce their own emissions, they in turn will press their suppliers to do better because they form their scope too, right? So like you mentioned, the driving forces behind doing or incentives behind doing better or accurate carbon accounting are different for different stakeholders. For the larger ones, at the end of the tail, it's mostly all of the three that I mentioned. And when you go down to more smaller businesses, or when the exchange is happening, it's more that customer demand, which is also customer demand for larger is more consumer based. for smaller enterprises, the customer demand is more, supply, the other enterprise based. So B2B there.
And then just touching upon how kind of Carboledger makes money. Is it kind of like a traditional SaaS model where companies have a subscription to the service, and then as they have more seats or licensees, then this just increases that reoccurring revenue?
Yes, it is. It's a typical SaaS model, and what we are doing right now is going more top down. So that's why I said we approach the larger enterprises first and have them go to their suppliers, asking them for to get down to their suppliers, have them input their data. In our case, for free. So we don't have a license based business model here. We give as many licenses because we want to take the network effect into play, and this is where we think the whole change in how carbon accounting is done is going to be, right. So if you start pricing, or if you start charging suppliers, the incentive to come on the network will be too low, and we want them to come. So what we charge just the larger enterprises, and for them the incentives are high because they want all of their stakeholders to be on one platform. So they of course agree to pay, and for their suppliers it's free of charge. So that is incentivized. It makes it easier for them to calculate, and also it makes them easier to give that kind of data to others, to all the other buyers that are not even on the platform. So what we think is, when other buyers also come to know that us most of our suppliers are using this platform, why not we become a part of the network as well. So
Yeah, I love how you're thinking about that. You really understand the incentive structure, and
mhm.
then kind of the customer type, and then that leads to benefits for all. And then shifting gears a little bit to this last section here, but thinking about the future. Um, you know, Historically there's been no shortage of financial accounting scandals,
Mhm.
with companies fudging numbers to appease different investors, etc. Do you foresee these types of issues coming to carbon accounting down the road once it becomes more of a commonplace that all companies need to participate in?
Yes, yes, of course. So I was listening to one webinars from the European Development Bank last year. It was again about how to bring standards all together to do carbon accounting in a better way, to make climate pledges more accountable, etc. And somebody raised the same question like you did, to the head of EDB, that no matter what we do, you come up with the standards. There is somebody who's going to do something, and what are you going to do about that? Somebody's going to fudge numbers. So he said that it's not that fudging of numbers has not happened with financial accounting. We did see Chevron happening. We did see all of everything coming down to shambles. But the world still got together again, started from the scratch, rectified its ways, and we have a good financial accounting principles now, where people fudge data still, but there are ways to punish, and then there are ways to eh, every time that it goes through a change, there are ways to make it more foolproof. So this is the kind of evolution that carbon accounting is also going to go through. We are going to make mistakes. There will be somebody who will fudge the system, who will make a fool of everyone else, but then we will be better off from it. We will learn how to do it better in the next steps, and then we will also have, as a result of it, have better standards, have better regulatory standards as well. So yeah, I think I derive my thought from what this person had to say about it. So yeah.
That makes total sense. I think to get to where you want to be, it's an iterative process,
Yes.
and a journey. One last question for you here. Just painting a picture here. It's 50 years from now, and there's a school auditorium filled with kids, and now they're replaying a recording of this conversation. What message do you have for the children of tomorrow on how you're able to stay hopeful?
Well, they are the hope, actually. The children of tomorrow are the hope, which I think most of us who are working in the climate space are working towards a better future for them. And since I am hopeful, I see that we have been 50 years from now, we have been able to be at a much better stage than what we are today. So for them, the message would be that there is so much more to do, and if we were able to do it, I'm pretty sure you can do it too, because your upbringing have been has been much with much more awareness, and so hopefully we were able to lay grounds for you to do better than what we did. And for your next generation, I hope you can do much more than what we were able to do for you.
Incredible. And that wraps up our first episode of the Climate Labs podcast, where we talk with people doing amazing things for our planet. And we hope to inspire people to join the climate movement. So thank you so much, Lavanya, for coming on board today.
Thanks, Ronak. Thanks again for having me. It was great chatting with you.